afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us today. It's a Monday after a long holiday, and we are experiencing a little technical difficulties. You may have noticed I am not Kathy Thunheim, who we are still hoping to have join us as host. But appreciate everybody joining us for this incredibly important topic. Thunheim has been very privileged to be working with MSPWin for many years on their strategic communications. Kathy, who was hoping and hopefully still will join us, also served as Governor Dayton's primary advisor for both of his terms on job creation in Minnesota, and serves on the boards of both the McKnight Foundation and the St. Paul, Minnesota Community Foundation. So we've had a lot of ties to this important conversation, and it is one we're very excited about today. Just like to give a little quick viewer guidance for everybody, but you will note that there is a chat function on the right side, but the audience will not be able to join chat or offer comments through that. There is a Q&A box on the lower portion of your screen that for all of the folks watching, we would encourage you to submit questions along the way if you have them. When we get to the end, we will try to get to as many of these questions as possible. So MSPWin was established for the purpose of identifying the challenges and the opportunities within our antiquated workforce system. It's a system that has failed to lift families out of poverty and deliver employers with skilled workers. Over the past 8 years, the organization has accomplished much, learned from our mistakes, and will sunset as intended in order to clear a path for what needs to come next. During that time it is operated, the organization is focused on grant making, establishing greater equity, fostering career pathways, and advocating for strategic planning based upon identification, transparency, and utilization of data resources. Considerable progress has been made across many of these areas of focus, but now, as we know, the economic and employment crisis that has accompanied the COVID pandemic has had deep ramifications for our region. In workforce development, these combined crises have highlighted the existing inequity in income, work, and opportunity, and has had a disproportionate impact on people of color. In recognition of the work begun by MSPWin, our panelists will help us understand where we find ourselves today and lay the groundwork for what we need to do to confront our regional workforce challenges in a way that creates shared prosperity for all of our residents. I'd like to turn to our distinguished panel today. Starting off, introduce Erin Olson. Erin will be our first presenter. She is with Real Time Talent, and we've asked Erin to help lay out a brief overview of kind of the current workforce challenges we're facing and the impact of COVID.
Thank you, Emmett, and good morning. My name is Erin Olson, and I'm the research strategist for Real Time Talent. I've been with the organization since its founding back in the fall of 2015 and have a background that spans housing, health, education, refugee resettlement, and workforce development. Real Time Talent has a long-standing relationship with MSPWin back to our organization's founding, when MSPWin provided early funding into our workforce research approach. Real Time Talent's impacts as an organization are thanks to that early trust that MSPWin placed in our organization to help influence data-informed workforce solutions that are both regionally strategic and build upon successful career pathway models, bringing more employers to the problem-solving table and creating more equitable solutions for all. If we could have the slides brought up on screen and shared. Nicholas, if you can assist me with that, that'd be great.
Yes, I will be sharing them here.
So the very first slide that you'll see will actually be of a wedge chart, as we've so called it. Back in 2016, MSPWin approached Real Time Talent with a request to quantify Minnesota's labor market shortage and what it would take to close the talent gap that was forecast. At that time, the labor pool was starting to get tight, and we were on the cusp of a shortage of talent. This work became the foundation of our narrative until the pandemic hit. By the end of 2019, we were already clearly experiencing a talent shortage. Statewide, the overall shortage was forecast to hit about 317,000 workers by 2025. This represented the number of workers that would be required to maintain the then current economic output, not to mention the persistent education gaps, skills gaps, and geographical mismatches, which would have likely made this shortage even more pronounced for Minnesota employers. Even more troubling, as of 2019, Minnesota was also in the midst of one of the most significant employment gaps between white and BIPOC talent in the nation. On the next slide, we break it down a bit further. Of all the strategies possible to address the talent shortage with the available labor force in our state, without a doubt, on the next slide, Nicholas. Without a doubt, addressing the racial and ethnic gaps in wage, employment, and career advancement in our workforce system had the potential to have that greatest impact on closing the talent gap. If we had been able to eliminate the disparities in employment present in our workforce system in 2018 by just over the next 6 years beyond that, it would have meant an additional 65,000 people working beyond the baseline forecasts from DEED under that status quo scenario. This is shown in purple on your screen. There are 3 big levers shown to the right that were our key issues at that time. First, bias and inequities in our processes, programs, and systems that perpetuate disparities. 2, mismatches in skills, education, experience, and geographies of talent compared to employer demand. And 3, the overall numbers problem of simply not having enough workers to meet our state's demand. The most reliable way to address the talent shortage was to more effectively include and elevate the potential of workers already living here, Minnesota's BIPOC population. On the next slide, we see the Twin Cities 7-county metro. In the metro alone, we were already experiencing a shortage of talent that hit about 62,000 workers by the middle of 2019. By the end of 2024, that shortage was estimated to grow to around 116,000 people short of what we would need simply to maintain the region's economic growth. That is 166,000 workers above and beyond what was officially forecast at that time. And today we find ourselves talking about a very different set of issues than this shortage headline that we'd heard so much about since 2015, with massive rates of unemployment and now dropping labor force participation rates. So even as we've seen that unemployment rate inching back up to the 4.6% range statewide and 4.3% here in the metro as of October, we've seen our labor force participation rate statewide and in the metro drop by 3 to 4% so far, and that's been a steady decline. Even in our best case scenario for our region, it could take an estimated 2 to 5 years for our region to get back on track to employment numbers and growth close to those baseline forecasts that had been set forth in that economic or employment outlook from DEED. So on the next slide, I've highlighted a new lens. This new workforce lens that we've brought to understand our current state identifies identities and opportunities and how they relate to critical vulnerabilities, whether they be community vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities tied to a particular industry or occupation. In this ever-shifting landscape that we're in, we're paying attention to, in some cases, what seem like entirely new things. But although things feel different now, we still have this reality of a talent shortage looming in our background. We still have employers that are struggling to find workers. Those same communities struggling to find steady, good jobs are those that are bearing the brunt of the pandemic's workforce impacts. If we rebuilt that talent wedge today, that purple equity triangle would be an even larger gaping hole of opportunities. In many ways, this new lens includes exactly the things that we should have always been concerned with. It is simply that this pandemic has expanded the number of people that have been negatively impacted by wage loss and barriers to access. The profiles of communities across our state and the metro area, more locally, have unique strengths and challenges to face when it comes to labor market disruptions the pandemic has brought. And our challenges are not a simple one-to-one match between an open job and a person who's unemployed. The decision-making process is much more complex right now. And we're attuned to these vulnerabilities tied to identities such as age, gender, race, access to insurance, income, access to technology, and even literacy. Ramsey County in particular, and communities of color across our region signal higher community level vulnerabilities that have unfortunately risen as leading indicators for negative impacts of the pandemic, both in health and economic senses. This is why participant voice and even neighborhood level insights are critical to changing how workforce and education programs work. industry vulnerabilities raise questions about the stability of local economies. So we use an economic vulnerability index updated by Shamar Economics in September. And according to this estimate, about 14% of jobs in the MSP Metro may be lost in the mid and long term due to local reliance on vulnerable industries. And this is where employer and industry leadership must occur, and at a regional level, because that's how our local economy works. And finally, the vulnerabilities tied to occupations that cause workers to perhaps weigh risk of viral exposure on the job and the potential impact on their households and loved ones. We've also discovered just how much of a luxury and privilege it is to even have the option to work remotely. And the broader community is starting to see truly how segmented our society is by education level, gender, race, and ethnicity along pathways of opportunity. In the MSP Metro, just over a quarter of workers applied for unemployment insurance benefits between March 16th and the end of August 2020. Half of all Black and African American workers applied for unemployment insurance in just this short time frame. Roles most heavily impacted were high contact intensity positions, those roles that are impossible to do without being in close contact with another person. And so here, this is where we need those smart solutions in programs and curriculum design. We've seen the data. We know that career pathway programs work, connecting the HR side of employers to those who design and deliver training and education programs. So as we look to careers of the future and the skills needed for our future workforce, paying attention to technology access, internet connectivity, and technology skills will also be keys to both eliminating persistent education and employment disparities in this rapidly changing environment. And finally, I leave you with a couple of the details on where these impacts have been most heavily felt. Of immediate concern are the interrupted wages and career path opportunities of our region's workforce due to job loss. The profile of people who are losing their jobs at this time at higher rates are particularly vulnerable in terms of income to debt burden, career stage, and household status in a way that will likely have dramatic long-term impacts beyond the crisis. In the Metro and statewide, we see women, BIPOC talent, people ages 20 to 34, and people with no college degree applying for unemployment insurance at much higher rates than other groups, especially early on in the pandemic. Women and BIPOC talent are also both more likely to hold high contact intensity roles that are associated with higher risk of exposure to the pandemic. BIPOC talent and those without a college degree are underrepresented in employment and jobs that can be done remotely or partially remotely. It's also important to note that BIPOC communities have worse health outcomes overall and higher rates of COVID-19 contraction, perhaps linked to those types of jobs that where we see that high contact intensity and exposure. So we need to get beyond thinking about rapid training and job placement of individuals and think about that whole financial health and stability of households and family units. Career pathways and career connected learning of all kinds, whether it be in our adult workforce system, K-12 or higher education, does work. It is tied to higher graduation and completion rates, higher credentialing rates, higher wages, and higher employment rates. And so the good news is that we have data. We have lots of data. We know what works and we know what needs work. Our critical question here is what we'll choose to do differently in this next chapter. What's the data telling us that we just maybe haven't been paying enough attention to? So thank you for your time this morning, and I look forward to hearing the rest of today's panel. I'll turn things back to Emmett and Kathy.
Thank you, Erin, and I think it's helpful for all the audience members to understand how COVID's added to our workforce challenges and made things even more difficult for us going forward. Next, we'll tee up Eric Mushler. Eric is with McVight Foundation, and he will share a bit about the impact of MSPWin and the work that it has accomplished over the space of time since it started. And Eric was one of the founding members, so he's perfect to have this conversation. Eric?
Thank you, Emmett, and I'm so happy that Kathy is on. It's good to see you.
Yeah. Sorry about that, everybody. Thanks everybody for being here.
And real-time talent and Erin in particular have been such a great addition to the workforce system. It provides real-time data on occupations across the state. In the region, they've done such good analysis of occupations and openings by sector, So it's an incredible body of work, and I think a real good addition to the system. So what we want to do today is really celebrate first, share learnings, and build a platform for action moving forward. So what I want to do is sort of celebrate the body of work that MSPWin advanced over the last 7 or 8 years. It's easy to say today we're in a very different world for workforce development than when we started. However, I could have said that before the COVID pandemic hit, and that speaks to a set of successes and influences that MSPWin had in the workforce development system. We certainly didn't achieve everything we hoped to at the beginning of the Funders Collaborative. We set a time horizon early on to end MSPWin for a couple of reasons. First, we didn't want to create a new institution that would continue far into the future. It's very often difficult to end something once started. So we started with an end in mind. Second, from experience, placing an end date helped us focus efforts with greater urgency to pursue systemic changes in the time frame and hold ourselves accountable to the progress that we could make collectively. So the evaluation is complete. It's now available online at MSPWin. And I'd encourage everyone to take a good look at it and review it as you consider your next agenda for action in the realm of workforce development. When we started MSPWin coming out of the Great Recession, we were motivated by an unemployment rate for African Americans that was 3 times the average of white households, and research that showed that even when controlling for education level, disparities in wages remain significant. These were 2 key targets that MSPWin focused on: access to employment and sustainable wages. So today, we can't cover all the successes and failures brought into the evaluation that come out of it, but we do hope to summarize by pointing out what we can celebrate, what we've learned, and what we leave as a platform for the next important workforce agenda to advance to greater equity in our state. So the evaluation states, quote, MSPWin played a leadership role in policy development and advocacy in the state and regional level. Through its thought leadership, research, and advocacy, the need for systems change in the public sector, workforce system is now widely acknowledged across many sectors, including business, government, philanthropy, and organizations that engage in workforce development. The report refers to spheres of influence. MSPWin created significant spheres of influence through its convening role that shifted the workforce development conversation from the status quo to the need for reform in critical ways, including first, to better engage and meet the needs of employers. A second, to increase and target resources and investment towards serving the goal for greater equity, providing communities of color more job opportunities that increase income and quality jobs. Third, through policy advocacy, MSPWin elevated an understanding of workforce issues and programmatic performance. It heightened expectations for the system with increased leverage of funds. It created data tools for decision makers to use, and it increased targeted funding to effective programs. MSPWin also advanced a shared consensus on the advantage of career pathways and effective and preferred model for impact. MSPWin advanced pathways toward critical economic sectors that showed high demand and offered more family-sustaining job opportunities and occupations. Not only did MSPWin invest a shared resource of $9 million towards its goals, members also provided an additional $75 million over this period to workforce development as members learned more. They invested in model career pathway programs, emphasized only high demand occupations with living wages or advancement opportunity, and increasingly supported programs that actually connected to credentials, certifications, and pathways that led to AA and BA degrees. So over this time period, career pathway programs funded through New Pathways to Prosperity program increased by 280% for a total of $37 million. DEED reports that people of color served with the P2P Workforce Investment Fund dollars doubled from 27% to 50% of participants served. In addition, MSPWin helped pass legislation creating the Uniform Report Card, for which all workforce programs must submit data. The data is disaggregated by race. It established standardized performance measures that would allow for comparison across different programs and for a more equitable reporting system. And this data is all publicly available on the DEED website. Now we just need to use it. Finally, MSPWin also promoted a regional perspective that the workforce development system be more strategic in setting goals and outcomes that enhance the economic competitiveness of the region by serving sectors of economic growth and getting more BIPOC workers into career pathways. The work disrupted business as usual and engaged regional business and elected leadership and other stakeholders in addressing equity while targeting sectors with demand and a clear desire to embrace more equitable employment practices and innovation. This work led to the creation of the Greater Metropolitan Workforce Council, which established, in partnership with the Center for Economic Inclusion, regional workforce development goals with macro and micro targets for populations of color. There was initial promise in the Greater Metropolitan Workforce Council, but ultimately the work fell short, as stakeholders could not agree on aligned priorities and a more pronounced focus on racial disparities, as well as a governance structure that was not manageable for its purpose, and inhibited by concerned system players. However, much was learned from this effort, and business, philanthropy, and some government partners remain interested in the next iteration of a regional workforce table as the COVID crisis hit us in March. So again, we're going to look next at lessons learned and a platform for the WISE-Ness action steps. And we will need to learn from both MSPWin's success and its limitations to truly build a more inclusive economy that benefits all of its residents with equity and opportunity. So I'm going to turn it back to either, I think, Kathy, who's going to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Eric. And we appreciate your sharing of the lessons, including the places where we've fallen short in the work to date. Next, we're going to hear from Aretha Green Rupert, who joins us now from the Carlson Family Foundation, but has a long association with MSPWin, was a board member for many years of its existence. And Aretha is going to share some of her thoughts about lessons learned and the work moving forward. Aretha.
Thank you, Kathy, so much. And also thank you to the panelists and to everyone spending the part of their day with us today. And Eric, thank you for walking through everything that's happened across the 8 years. I was a part, not at the beginning, quite at the beginning of MSPWin, but it is great to kind of have this moment to kind of reflect back on the work that was done by the partners and the advisory board. My last part of being with MSPWin before I went to Carlson Family Foundation, I got a chance to co-chair the work that was happening. So I'm very excited to kind of share what we walked away with from that experience. As you can imagine, 8 years and a group of philanthropic organizations, we learned a lot in that process, but there were definitely kind of 3 themes that emerged from our work. First, definitely really the need to listen to Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations that are led by BIPOC community, and definitely those organizations that impact the BIPOC community. That's very essential to the work that when we came into that. But as it evolved, we recognized that we need to make sure that our table was big enough that we not only was doing work to impact, but that we brought those voices into our work, because that's very critical. And we also recognize that in order to do this work effectively, we really need to make sure that the workers, employers were driving that strategic direction and that policy direction. It's very easy for a group of funders sitting in a different space to kind of make decisions, but we wanted to make sure that we had the folks who were going to be most impacted at the table. Did we get this right all the time? We did not. There were moments and opportunities that were missed, and definitely the last 2 years of MSPWin as we begin to wrap up, we really stopped to really take a reflective moment at ourselves and the work that we were doing, knowing that good work has happened, but we also recognize that we really need to make sure we were opened up to everyone around the table. Again, like Eric, I invite everyone to visit the MSPU website. There's so much information there. One of the last big bodies of work that was done was research with the underrepresented job seeker. Very impactful work that not only was a nice bookend to the work of MSPWin, but definitely will impact funders, or folks in workforce development as you move forward. So I do encourage you to go read that report and that insight. And I think it definitely speaks to the data that Aaron talked about, looking at workforce, but holistically looking at all of the needs that need to be addressed, particularly for our underrepresented workers and our BIPOC workers. So I definitely encourage all of you to go to that. And definitely we learn at MSPWin, we need to be intentional, that all of this is about relationships and being a trusted partner around the table. And that is definitely something that we've done and we did more of. And that's definitely something that we want people to take forward with them who are looking at this work, who are looking at doing this type of systems work. No surprise to anyone, kind of my next theme is systems work is hard. It is definitely pushing the proverbial boulder up the hill. And you can imagine as this work was started with a group of philanthropic organizations entering into the fray, so to say. Definitely we as philanthropy, folks who work in philanthropy, we've done systems work before. I don't know if we were all quite ready for what was involved with workforce development. It is definitely an ecosystem that has lots of different players that come around the table, both from federal, state, and local entities, higher education, K through 12 education, community organizations, individual stakeholders, really understand that very complex entrenched system that has been established for decades. And here we were coming into that system, not necessarily making demands, but asking a lot of questions. And you can imagine there were folks who were like, well, who is this group of funders and do we have to listen to them? And can they come in and ask those kinds of questions? And so that was hard work, but as Eric walked through the things we were able to achieve, we definitely brought with us not just coming in as funders, but we had a compassion and a passion for this work. And I think that was so important. I think that was definitely from the onset of it, is that we saw the opportunity for the community that we've all worked in and been a part of. And we really wanted to be able to leverage not only what we were doing as funders individually, but collectively, could we come together? Collectively, could we impact the system? So that's where that system change work came in. And that was just so important as we move forward, being able to not only work individually with the nonprofits, but to really look at the system as a whole, where there are missed opportunities, where there funding that could be leveraged in a different way, and really to be a part of that work was so important. And we recognize that there's complex work. And for us at MSPWin as the advisory members, it really gave us an opportunity because we didn't have, a stake in the ground in terms of the work itself because we didn't do that work every day. We were funders of that work. So it really gave us an objective opportunity to ask questions that maybe some of the nonprofit organizations could not ask because of their nature of the relationships they had with many of the government entities or funders. So we could ask those questions. We can push maybe where other people could not push. And I think that brought so much credibility to the work that we were able to do. So that was just so important, that role that we were able to fill being neutral parties in this, with only the end game of the mission of which MSPWin was created under. The last thing, and this was kind of evident from the onset that this work, and you've heard this already, and you'll hear it again as we talk about moving forward, is this really has to be regional work. This is not about one neighborhood or one community. When you look at where employers are putting their facilities, when you look where employees are coming from, this is across our region. We knew so much before the pandemic. We've learned so much now that we really have to step back and take this regional approach of understanding what impacts one impacts all of us. We've said that before, but we really get that. So we look at how employers, and even before the pandemic, we had so many employers who were being more creative about how they brought employees in, what other things they need to have addressed in place to make sure they were able to leverage employees from around the region. And that's going to be even more important. I think we talked about the fact some of us have the luxury, as we are all sitting here, to work from home. We know so many jobs don't afford you that luxury, but that's going to have an implication as we go forward. We know that already technology and automation and communication systems had an impact, but the fact that so many people are working from home will have so much more impact as we think about the workforce of the future, and really making sure that we're looking at this from the regional standpoint is going to be even more critical as we go forward, to make sure that we're not leaving even more people behind in this work, and really taking that moment to step back and say, what is best for this entire area? And that region keeps shifting and changing as to where workforce is coming from and how they're being impacted. So those are just a few of the things. There are definitely lots more. I know we're going to share that final report. There are lots of things to listen in there, but those are definitely the three big themes we wanted to lift up right now. And I'm going to kick it back to Kathy, and we're going to talk about where do we go from here.
Thank you, Aretha. Thank you, Aretha, and thanks for your work over the span of this MSPWin work. As we're going to turn to our last presenter, And then we'll hope to have some time on the back side of this last presentation to take a couple questions. I see I'm getting some in from participants, so thank you for those and keep them coming. Our final presenter is Pahua Yang Hoffman, who has been involved in this work from a couple of different vantage points, but comes to us now from the St. Paul, Minnesota Community Foundation. And we've asked Pahua to kind of focus on the path forward. So Pahua, let me turn it to you. Great to see you.
Thanks, Kathy. It's great to be here to join the virtual stage with Aretha, Eric, and Aaron, and you. I get the very fun job of pulling together much of what you've already heard this morning. So my first involvement with MSPWin was not as a funder, but as a nonprofit. I was involved with the higher education attainment goal that interfaced with the work of MSPWin. And so I do come at it with a couple of sets of experiences. So I get the fun job of talking about where do we go from here? What is the platform for action? So what you've already heard from Aaron, I'll just repeat again that the COVID pandemic has created an economic and employment crisis with broad and deep ramifications. In workforce development, this moment has really amplified the disproportionate impacts and inequities in income, in work, and in opportunity. And as we chart a recovery, and I might even suggest a reimagining, it is even more critical to learn from our recent history and approach reform of workforce development boldly, with a clear eye on the benefits of equity, racial equity in particular, in building a stronger economic future with truly shared prosperity. So I'm gonna list up 4 tentpole items. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are 4 things that I think we've already heard this morning and certainly came up in our final report. The first is to center reform on the end users. This may seem obvious, but too often there are well-meaning goals to serve an intended audience without actually including them at every step in the process. At the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, we ask ourselves 3 questions when we do our grant making. Who is informing this work? Who is forming this work? And who stands to benefit from this work? And I think it applies here in this conversation. BIPOC job seekers, other workers, and employers who are customers of the system must be engaged. These individuals experience firsthand what is working and what is not. From meaningful representation on local boards to inclusion with authority in reform efforts, these voices must be given priority to achieve meaningful reform. This may take more effort. This may take longer. At times, the very people we need to engage will have the least amount of time to give us. And there will always be criticism in this space. You can never hear from enough people, but I encourage us all not to rush this piece. Number 2, use data to drive equitable decision-making. Again, we've heard much of this already this morning, but I would actually like to restate that we all know, you all know, data are just facts and figures. For data to be useful, data needs to be interpreted and organized to make them useful in decision-making. MSPWin has already laid a foundation for quality information. Eric talked about this already, the legislative uniform report card, real-time talent, you heard from Aaron. Eric also mentioned disaggregated data. This is essential to see a truer picture of system limitations and performance. In order to ensure that all residents of the state are included in the recovery and reimagining of a future workforce, we need to mine and interpret this data to create needed information to drive decisions about where to target limited resources for the best return on investment. Number 3, utilize and bolster career pathway models. Aaron mentioned career pathway models work. They are effective. I think what we need is to build stronger connections with human services, transportation, and childcare, just to name a few things. These need to be built into the model. Further, a definition of pathways should include the clear and intentional connection to credentials, certifications, and post-secondary education system and its resources. to ensure that workforce development advances real opportunity to communities of color for family-sustaining quality jobs in occupations that represent the future of work. System resources should also offer flexibility and integrated resources to fully expand and use these models. And then the last piece, which Aretha also mentioned, to activate and enable strategic regional planning. The labor market is regional. And to serve employers and workers, strategy and investment decisions require a regional perspective and response. So the planning efforts initially spearheaded by Greater Metropolitan Workforce Council must continue. Any regional effort that transcends a single organization's mission, a city or county jurisdiction, will have tension. But tension is a needed feature, not a bug. The effort can and should be advanced by building on the experience and knowledge we already have in place, but we need to dial up and increase the integration and be more regionally connected over time. Kathy, those are my comments.
Thanks very much, Bahua. We've got a few questions already in the pipeline, and I want to give everybody who's listening in this opportunity to throw something into the Q&A box if you've got a question. But let me start with a couple that we've gotten already, and I'll do this in sort of quick round robin fashion. Ask each of you to answer this question. If you could do one thing differently from this experience of the last 7 or 8 years, what would it be? Erin, you want to start?
Thank you, Kathy. I didn't know you were going to ask me to go first on this particular question. It's a great question, and it's a really challenging one. I think if we had to start over again, I think maybe I think that piece of the centering reform on end users is a really critical one, and it's so challenging because you have to constantly remind yourself that that's really what you're about, that the end user really has the final say and final ownership of an initiative and is able to really say if there's been success or not, and that takes real dedication and commitment to that. And so I would say having that really consistently at the forefront at the very beginning is the key.
Thanks, Erin. I will tell you that one of the other questions that came in really gets to that exactly. How do we ensure that the worker voice, that the end user voice is a part of this? So, but Eric, I'll put you on, I'll just go in the order that you spoke. Eric, if you could do one thing differently, what would it be?
You know, I think we had more of an inside strategy than an outside strategy. So
Okay.
I think about how do you build an external strategy that actually reinforces and communicates well with an inside strategy. I just think that we could have done more in that area, and it would have, I think, built more powerful movement for change and transformation.
Let me just push you. Define inside and outside. Who's on the inside and who's on the outside?
Well, I mean, we tended to be, you know, kind of policy bubble focused. We were very analytical in our approach versus, you know, one of the last things that we did with $500,000 in grant making in the last year was actually funding some very grassroots organizing groups like C-Tool and others. But that sort of investment adds a whole different perspective and level of knowledge to what's needed in a workforce development system. You know, we didn't have ways to ask questions to people that were using the system as easily as we had the ability to talk with the providers, the ability to talk with the policymakers. So that's what I mean by sort of outside, more informed from different perspectives that could have built a much stronger sort of comprehensive way to think about transformation of the system.
Important lessons, that's great. Aretha, you're up. If you could do one thing, what would it be?
Yeah, I think we've probably got a theme going. I think for me, particularly my last year with MSPWin, that underserved worker voice. I think that was just kind of so crystal clear when we had I remember very starkly the meeting that we had with some BIPOC leaders when we talked very frankly, and I was glad that they were very open with us about some of their concerns as we were working on some legislative action. And that really was important. And we took that to heart, and we did a lot of internal work and had lots of conversations about where there are opportunities that we missed and where could we do things differently. And I think we course corrected, I would say, as best we could, given the time limitations, and we knew that we were about to sunset, but definitely having that much more upfront in the process would have been critical. And I think the other thing for me, even as we had, got that information from folks, through the research and the conversation, is really having, real conversation around that intersectionality of what individuals and families are dealing with. We definitely talked about workforce, but we know it's so much more complexity that families are dealing with as we talk about, not just transportation, but childcare and mental health and maybe other things that they're trying to deal with and address. And all of that comes into play when we talk about work. It's not just whether or not you were trained and I've been able to place you into work, but understanding collectively what needs to happen for a family. And I think the other part of that, and this has come up a lot, so I have several things, is just, even with employers, understanding how employers needed to change their own culture and space. As they talk about bringing in more BIPOC individuals, had they done the work internally to make sure not only did folks come, but were they retained, did they stay, did they feel comfortable in that space? And there's definitely work to be done in that space as well.
Yeah, can they be successful, right? Fahua, any thing you would add?
I mean, I just echo what was already said, but I think from someone new to the funder table, I would say from the outside as a nonprofit, it seemed, to Eric's point, inside and top down. So I think Aretha mentioned the worker voice is key, which is why it's #1 on my list to center it on the end users. And I think sometimes we are so motivated to make policy change, to work with decision makers, that we forget about the voice of those who are actually using the system. So, I always try to ground myself on who actually is most impacted by these issues. And I mentioned in my comments to have them be involved at every step of the process. And I don't do this particularly well always too, but I think that sometimes we think, let's get this 3/4 of the way baked and share it, when that might actually already be too late, right? So how do we involve that authentic voice at the beginning all the way through that process? And I think that if we are all to do that over again, I'm sure that would be one thing that we would do differently.
I think a follow-up question that's coming through that really feeds off what each of you have said is that, is it realistic to expect the philanthropic sector to be more engaged in what we would call organizing, community organizing around these issues going forward? Is that an appropriate role? And maybe I'll add a little corollary to the question. Are there players missing from this work as we think about it going forward? Are there other players in our ecosystem who need to be engaged in this work who haven't been? I don't know who wants to take it on. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's some conclusions around just quality of job that we have to face, because we have lost a whole set of occupations and work that is not paying enough, right? And so that leads to some more, I think, organizing from philanthropies, and I can speak more from McKnight's standpoint, that is actually an area that needs to get more attention, because the quality of work and what the rewards of work are needs to be really looked at again. So I think that's a huge sort of aha as far as an area that needs some more attention going forward.
Any of you want to add to that? Otherwise, I'll jump to the next question, which is, or maybe just pick up on Eric's last comment. It is interesting to think about the serendipity of what the pandemic has done to reinforce to all of us that there are real misalignments between the value of people's work and how we as a society, identify them as essential, and yet maybe not a living wage. So that whole body of work around how do we engage the worker voice what I'm hearing you all say is has to include acknowledgement that the value of some work isn't being recognized. Yeah. Then there's a couple questions about data, and specifically, Aaron, to you, does the real-time talent work include enough information to help stakeholders out there who want to be able to draw connections between needs of workers, preparation of workers, and sort of getting people to the career pathing? Talk a little bit about how people access that data, or how organizations can access that data.
Certainly. Was this the question from Liz? Liz's question?
Yes.
In the chat? Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, in fact, we have done quite a lot of research looking at the opportunities in our region by occupation, breaking those occupations down into the necessary skill sets, the educational requirements that are typical. And the great thing is, like I said, we have so much data. We have a strong basis of labor market information from DEED. We are also able to access a plethora of data from online job postings, from candidate profile data for those jobs that where people participate in professional networking sites like LinkedIn, for example. And so we really have a really strong sense of what employers need and what our talent pool has and who's currently employed. The question is, it takes a really long time for that data, that information, to be translated into knowledge and then into action. So getting it from is something that we have that information, and getting it to actually doing something with it, it has a long path, especially in systems that require quite a lot of processing of that information to get it to that end state. So like in higher education in particular, we just see a long lag time with being able to really get something into a program, really evaluating that curriculum. By the time it gets rolled out, oftentimes it needs to be reevaluated again against employer needs. And so sometimes that timing, being able to really be responsive can be a big challenge, but we do have that data. I responded to that question in our chat as well. If you're interested in looking at data by sector, please visit our website. We've got a couple of very current reports that do dig into the pandemic's most recent impact by sector. So everything from hospitality and tourism to IT here in the 7-county metro and other parts of our state. So definitely take a look.
Participant or the panelists may have also seen in the chat another question about, is there, while we all seem to acknowledge that the worker voice is something we need to work harder to incorporate into this work, did we make any headway? Are there hints from the work that's been completed so far that might give us a head start into thinking about how to do that more effectively in the work going forward? What are effective and respectful ways to get those voices? Any thoughts or learnings?
So, I mentioned before the last sort of round of grant making that we did, and that's continuing forward in the sense of we're continuing to support the convening of about 5 or 6 of those grantees to try to garner some insights from organizing groups and workers that are on the front lines in particular right now. I mean, one is the restaurant workers, right? And that group that's organizing is on the front lines in every stretch of the way. The other area, and I think increasingly the connection to students at community colleges becomes really important. That is a workforce. The average age in that constituency is not 18 going to college for the first year. It is actually up in the upper 20s as an average age. Aaron can correct me how wrong I am, but I think it's like 27 or 28. And so that's another place where there actually are student groups that may be able to actually provide better insights into a workforce needs or their training needs or where they see a future in work. So those are a couple of areas where we sort of dabbled in that I think, you know, again, if we read the report and use the information from the report, we can be smarter about moving forward. One of the things on data that I did want to mention, I mean, MSPWin testified twice this year, both before the COVID, you know, really hit and right after. And, you know, one of the things that was distressing to me was we have this uniform report card. And as we were talking with the jobs committee, it was very clear that they didn't know that there was this uniform report card. They thought it was some report that we would give them. And it's like, no, that's online. When you're thinking about, you know, line items of support to organizations, it is available to you right now. And it was clear that there was not that knowledge. So, you know, one of the evaluation suggestions is actually following up with the legislature, making sure that that information is readily used and available to them, and they know how to use it. Because I think we need to use the data that we have as well.
And this is Aretha. I just want to add, I did reference when I talked about the insights that can be found on the MSPWin website regarding the underserved worker. I do encourage people to go and read that, because not only does it have, it was great work done by young people at Juxtaposition, Imagine Deliver, really going out into the community and having those conversations. So I do, you know, really want everyone to go out and read that, because not only does it give you kind of just, you know, a collapsible, you know, look at everything, but it really is some good, just raw data of just, you know, kind of the quotes and things from workers as well as from employers. So I really think that's gonna, you know, really give some insight as to where people are. And it would be interesting wherever the work goes next, because that was done at a very different point in time. So much has happened now. It would be very interesting to see how many of those things stand the test of time, because I can imagine some of them were, you know, happening before the pandemic, still happening, and overlay that with what people are experiencing now as a result of the pandemic and that increased demand that's on them, particularly as Eric talked about the group of organizations that were funded. We know they have always been on the front line in the trenches working with folks, and we know even more so now because of the pandemic. So we have, the one thing about MSPWin, we were inundated with data, and we have a lot of it. So it really is, how do we use it and how do we move forward with it?
And
Thank
Kathy,
you.
I would just
Yeah,
add,
please.
what you said is, I think data is important, but in all my times working in policy, it's the stories that the data tell that move people. So I think that what we need to do a better job is help tell the stories, and whether that's doing more convenings, you know, Aretha raised a really great example of young people's voices, but how do we make that data come to life for people, our policymakers, our employers, and even tell those stories to the workers themselves to see, is this in fact, you know, your experience? And I think that that lived experience coupled with experts, policy experts, is how we're going to get there.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing a couple of different things in the Q&A and the chat, linking you to the reports. Aaron, there was one other question specifically for you. I hope you can handle that one. We are at the top of the hour here in just a few seconds, so I want to take the moment to thank our panelists very, very much. First of all, for being with us today, but also for the extraordinary work over the arc of MSPWin's efforts. I want to thank all of the attendees for giving us this hour of your time and some great questions and discussion. This is, as all the panelists have reflected, this is not only important work, but it's really complicated work, and it requires lots of collaboration and acknowledgement of the intersectionality, as Aretha mentioned. We have made great progress as a region. We have great progress yet to make. And thanks to everybody for the commitments they've made to that work. If you have any questions or have trouble accessing any of the links, don't hesitate to reach out to the team at Toonheim, who's sort of behind the scenes on this event today. I want to apologize for my not being able to be available at the very beginning. Never quite had that Zoom problem. I was ready to make jokes about how we're all getting good at Zoom, and then I wasn't. So I had to leave it alone, but I apologize for being late to join you. Thank all of you for the work you've done. Have a great rest of the day. Stay safe, stay well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.